Welcome to Just an Average Citizen, the podcast that helps to educate, inform, and empower you to make an impact in Abilene and the Big Country. I am excited to join you for this Book by the Bite. This is our Wednesday episodes that go through books that we are dealing with in our cultural issues of our area. And so I'm really excited you got to join me for this second part of Queering of the American Child. I just want to let you know this episode is sponsored by Republic Fence, and I personally recommend Cole and the guys at Republic Fence to build a fence for your home or business. They specialize in residential style privacy fencing that will enhance the beauty and security of your home. I want to say Cole and Judah are great people, conservative Christian guys, and they will do a great job for you at an honest price. You can contact them at republicfencetexas.com. So it is so important that we get people engaged in this conversation, because that is sometimes the biggest battle, is not even knowing what the cultural battle is, but being able to discuss it and have conversations to become more informed about what's going on. And many times people are afraid to touch these topics. So it's so important that you subscribe to this podcast and share it with your family and friends so that everyone can have the opportunity at least to be exposed to it. So the more familiar you become with different cultural issues, the easier it is for you just to naturally flow into conversation. And I've used this analogy so many times. The thing about dealing and engaging with the cultural issues of our time is it's not something that you can just step in cold turkey and succeed 100% every time. It's one of those things that you have to hone a skill. You have to hone that communication ability. And the only way you can hone it is by practicing it. Just like a professional athlete would not assume his skills are up to par because he shows up to the game and is ready to perform. He actually practices and goes through scenarios so that he can feel and experience what it's going to be like in the actual game. And so it's great to have a group around you that you can say stupid things, that you can try out new understandings that you have, so that you can find what are holes that you have in your knowledge base and what are some things that you're succeeding in. And I'm so grateful anytime someone has the courage to say, hey, listen, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying, or I don't really think I agree with you. Those are beautiful words to me, because it's not a threat against my identity, because I know who I am. It is a opportunity to engage with someone and come out a better person on the other side through growth of knowledge, or even opportunities to engage in a deeper relationship with people who are desiring for or more than just the surfacey relationships that we so often find ourselves surrounded by. So let's take out the negativity of conflict and recognize that conflict is not the problem. It's how we conflict, how we argue, how we engage that is the problem. And so if you have a critical heart, or if you have some issues with a certain group of people that you really just have some biases against, I don't know how to say that word, then you're going to engage differently, more of a harshness than if you understand what the purpose is, and that is to make an impact on our community and help people know their value and worth, because, we want to be a place that carries the kingdom. We want to be people who carry the kingdom, and so that can only be done by walking in a gentle spirit. And gentle doesn't mean that you lay down and are walked over. Gentle just means that you're not about the destruction and the victory of knowledge, of the knowledge battle, but you're actually caring about the heart of the person. So it can be easily misconstrued, and that is also something that you have to learn how to practice to navigate through. And I've grown so much. I did it in the beginning with a lot less softness. And so if you've ever had a conversation with me, you can only imagine what life was like before I learned to soften the edges. So anyway, this segment is going to be a lot shorter than the last one. So I may accidentally fill up some time with some of the conversations that we need to have. And Okay, so before we get started, I do want to discuss a concept that is really important for us to learn how to navigate through, and it's called the Mott and the Bailey. And I'm so thankful that James Lindsay went to such depth on this topic, helping to understand why we need to be careful which battles we wage and what is the ultimate one that we're trying to find to get the victory in. And it's a concept that has been so helpful for me to understand where and what I need to engage in. So I actually found a picture of it. And here is a picture of some place in England. And so you can see it's got this outer fence around it where the people actually live, and that's called the Mott. And it's defensible because it has an outer barrier. But what happens if this is breached, or they feel like this is going to breach, then everybody comes into this really tall, small area. Now, it's not a great example of one, but you get the concept. Here, you can see they've got a tighter fence around it, and it's a very small protected area, so it's really more challenging to get up to. And so why this is the way it is in a cultural war is what you think about is there's this idea that is kind of, it's a safe topic to talk about, but it's not really, it's easily, you can tear it down and make it, you can disprove it. And so what they have is a Bailey idea, which is something that at the core of what they're trying to do, they cannot let this fall. If this falls, everything falls. This area, it can be rebuilt. This area will destroy everything, just like the heart of this community. The Bailey is what has to be protected at all costs. So like I mentioned last time, and I just want you to help understand this concept. So many times people who typically are more conservative or known for their compassion and known for their kindness, they get stuck out here battling, and they're never going to win because it really doesn't matter. It's a distraction. We've got to start to going to the Bailey idea and make sure that it is what we do to destroy these ideas that are toxic. Like queer Marxism, like this book talks about, it is toxic. We must destroy it. But what a lot of us have gotten distracted by, even myself, I struggle with it because I'm always like, okay, is this really the battle I need to be fighting? Or is this not the battle? So for example, drag shows, drag shows there's all different versions of them. Whether or not we agree with them, this is a Mott. Because at the end of the day, if we stop drag shows, it's not going to stop the actual toxic part of it, which is the queer Marxism. It is what destroys everything that we hold dear. And so we've got to make sure that we stay focused, not on the little battles, but actually on the one that's going to take out the heart of this. And that is, you are not your own God. You are not the savior of the world. You are not what brings your fulfillment in life. The only path through that is God. And so it's a very anti-God, anti-Western idea, this whole Marxism, queer Marxism, because it flies in the face of what we have known for millennia. Is that the right way to say that? That God is what gives us our identity. He gives us our purpose. Okay. So I want you to understand and start to look around your culture and see, what is the Bailey? Or if you see an idea, go, is this a Mott or the Bailey? Is the what's taking place in our city right now with the conversation about the sculpture? Is the sculpture the Bailey or the Mott? I would say it's the Mott. And I'm trying to get everybody to wake up to the Bailey. But if we allow the Mott in our city, it could be challenging to get it out, and it gives a stronghold for a Bailey to be built around it. Does that make sense? All right, so let's go ahead and get into the book. I hope that makes sense. And I'm happy, as always, to discuss things with people. The only way we grow and learn as a community is by talking about things and having conversations. So I really hope that we can foster that more. One of the things I will say that is so troubling is there's a group of people who have relationships. They know, they have friendships and relationships. And when they see something they don't like, instead of asking the person that they know, say, hey, is this what's going on? I don't understand it. They just go off half cocked and actually start promoting things that are factually untrue. But because they are more concerned with promoting, I would dare say, a Mott, they are distracted by what the Bailey is, that they'll lie and deceive people. I'm not going to go so far as to say intentionally. I think they have a broken system of communication. So like if, I see that you wear a shirt that says, I hate red, and I'm like, oh my gosh, And I go telling everybody, you are such a snob. You have only, you don't like anything but what you like. And you are just dismissive of anyone who doesn't like other things, who don't like, and if I just go and talk about it rather than going, wow, why don't you like red? Well, because it brings out, the big red mole I have on my forehead. Oh, okay. I mean, it's so silly, the things that are going on in our culture, and we could solve so many problems if we would just have conversations, but we're not allowed to. That is not the approved path forward. The approved path forward, or the approved narrative, is this: you just go along and get along. And anyone who questions, which will understand, is part of the queer Marxism. If you question anything, then you are in conflict with this. If you choose to have conversations, you're in conflict with it. And so when I see people who refuse to have conversations, I realize that they're probably more entrenched in this than they realized, because the shutting down of conversations is not an American idea. It's not a Western idea. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think the art of conversation is something we've lost, and we've got to start doing that better. And I'm so sorry I'm now so far into this without even actually starting the book. But I just want you to understand that we are not talking about theories. We're not talking about ideas. We're seeing this happen in real time. And that's why this is something I'm so passionate about, because I think if we can get to the heart of it, like we failed to get at the heart of critical race theory, we failed to get the heart of intersectionality, that we failed to get the heart of critical legal theory, or critical theory in general, we've missed it. And there are still people talking about race if race is the problem, but we've moved on. Race was the transition into where we're in now. Everything is in transition into the next level of deconstruction, of destruction. And if you stay in one area too long, then you're going to find yourself behind the times and irrelevant to most conversations. So I'm kind of trying to push us a little ahead, but I'm not sure if I'll succeed. But it is something fascinating to learn about, to say the least. Okay, so let's go ahead with the second part of queering of the American child. And I know you might be like, well, I don't have kids in school. I don't have kids. Mine are all grown. You have grandkids. You know people who have kids. You care about the future generations of our community. So this applies to all of us. The subtitle is How a New Religious Cult Poisons the Minds and Bodies of Normal Children, or Normal Kids, by Logan Lansing with James Lindsay. And again, my desire is to honor this author, both of these guys, because they've worked so hard to do the research and study, and they've put it in a really palatable book that makes it easy to understand if you haven't done some deep diving into this topic very much. I really think you'll learn so much of it, and it's something that is worth reading again and again. Okay, so we're to part 2, the practice. So the first part was more of theory. This is the practice. All right, so chapter 5, the queer classroom. Queer activists create queer classrooms. Queer classrooms are all about inclusion. All right, I'm going to pause here because this is so important. We started being inundated with critical race theory back in 2020. It was overwhelming in our face. And they said it's not critical race theory. They hem-hawed around it. And so now our laws have slowly changed to stop critical race theory, which is now being called DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And just like the 1964 civil rights laws, they have now been included, not like the laws. The laws haven't changed, but everything surrounding it, which makes people think, all the laws have changed, that it includes gender identity or sexual identity. And so the problem is many people are like, we don't want racism. We like the fact that we can be more aware of it. But in fact, DEI is the problem, because diversity, equity, inclusion is not about everyone. It's about specific Marxist ideology, which is what queer Marxism is. I mean, it's moved into queer Marxism. And you have to understand that, even for me to say this, there are going to be people who say, oh, well, you're just racist, or you're the problem because you call it racist. But actually, anything that defines you by the color of your skin is racist. And for so many years, we tried to give a hand up to people who had suffered in the past. But as we have found, you can only deal with the current circumstance. You cannot make up for past sins by giving people an advantage. And so programs like affirmative action, or I'm trying to think of something else right now the diversity, equity, inclusion, allowing the way that we have to have a demographic makeup in everything from airline companies to university boards or faculty and staff that it is proportionate to the demographic makeup of our society is failing us. To say that you have to have only 60% white and 13% black, and I don't know, is it 20% Mexican, all on a board, you've flipped the script, and it's now no longer about an ability to do a good job. It's about the color of your skin, and that in itself is racist. The problem is now that everyone's concerned about racism, they've moved into another part of inclusion, which is sexual identity. And if I cannot stress this enough, anyone under the age of 18 doesn't need to be worried about their sexual identity. And I would dare say if we even just bumped it to like 12 or 13, I mean, elementary school kids do not need to be included based on their sexual identity. It is just not a thing. It is age inappropriate to have a child define their sexual identity in elementary school, 100%, no doubt. Okay. And so what they've done is now we've gotten everybody concerned about including everyone unless you don't agree with them. And that's what we're finding even in our city, is that if you don't agree with the inclusivity of everyone, then you're excluded. If you hold to the tenets of the Christian faith, which says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It's not just about making sure things evening the playing field, then you get into a bunch of problems. And so the struggle is now that we don't want to just talk about DEI, which they've banned in the state universities. And guess what? Everyone has just changed the name. Literally, that's what they do. Because that's why our laws are the way they are. They're not meant to stop cultural movements. They're meant to stop things that long-term are the problem, get to the root of the problem, get to the Bailey of the problem, not just deal with all these little mots all over the place. And so we've got to be aware of that. I know that's a lot of information, but if you don't understand, inclusion means you have to agree with anything but the Western idea, the Western civilization. The Christian faith is excluded from this inclusion. Then you can be in the battle. Well, you can't take a position that's not neutral. If you want to be inclusive, then you cannot be Christian. You can't, because that is the very it defies everything about inclusion. Christianity defies inclusion. All right. And so I just wish some of these people who are the gatekeepers of our city would understand that you are losing the battle by including everybody. It is not an inclusive group. It is an exclusive group labeled inclusive, because ultimately they only want people like them. And ultimately it's people who are not a part of anything that represents the Christian heritage. And so I think I've belabored on that long enough, but okay. So queer activists create queer classrooms, and queer classrooms are all about inclusion. All right. Inclusion, like the practice of queering, is a never-ending practice. A space can only ever be in the state of becoming inclusive. Do you understand that? You can never become inclusive. You are always becoming inclusive. You're always having to reach the next goal, strive to the next place. It is never satisfied. In the context, inclusion first entered. Now, my husband says he doesn't like it when I read things that aren't highlighted, but that's the nature of the game. I'm sorry. I'm trying to give context to some of these smaller highlights. Inclusion first entered the educational lexicon in the context of student disability. Queer activists have since queered inclusion. So it used to be a healthier, more focused on including those who had some minor disabilities that would still allow them to participate in normal society, but they didn't have to have a lot of adaptations. Now they've queered it, so it has to be inclusive, means you have to allow everything, even if it's not based on any truth of any kind. The practice, let's see here. Okay. Inclusion is the practice of radically politicizing an environment on queer theory's terms, forcing anything that might make someone feel unsafe or unwelcome out the door. All right. So where inclusion is, in the practice, inclusion is more precisely defined as a lack of exclusion, where exclusion is caused by the presence of evil spirit queer theory names like cis-heteronormativity. Normativity. I can't say that word. Okay, so if you believe in traditional views of men and women defined in relationships, then you are exclusive. You are not inclusive. So anything tradition-wise is exclusive and is not inclusive. So you can never satisfy this desire for inclusion if you hold the fact that men and women should be in relationship together And that's it. Inclusive classrooms are classrooms where everyone must be made to feel like they are included by excluding everything queer theory doesn't like and compelling everything it does like. Okay, did you hear that? You have to exclude everything that queer theory doesn't like. Queer theory doesn't like God at all. There is no room for God because man is your God. Man is what brings about the salvation of society. It's not God. Queer activists believe that heteronormativity works primarily through language, so they are determined to control, compel, and police speech. Okay. One of the primary objectives of queer activists is to remove gendered language from classrooms. You know, we don't call them boys and girls. We call them children. We don't call them men and women. We call them people. I mean, like, there's no way to gender language and be inclusive. School staff members should address students by their name and pronoun corresponding to the gender identity that is consistently asserted at school. And they do not have to tell parents if that is different from what is going on at home. Just listened to a podcast the other day about a lady who's, when she told the school she wasn't going to comply with calling her daughter a boy's name and using the male pronouns, they called CPS on her and had her child. They came and checked her out because she was being non-inclusive to her child. Many school districts clearly state that queer theory is now a legally protected ideology and religion. Okay, they state it, but here's the nuance of it. It's not really gone through the legal process, so there's some confusion. But sometimes the fiction of the law is more lived out than the actual law itself, and I think this is one of those cases. Once queer theory enters policy and classroom practice, it becomes incredibly difficult to weed it out. Queer theory bulldozes its way into classrooms under threat of labeling people bigots and conservatives. Hey, I have been labeled those things, and they do it to shut you up, and they do it to get you to comply, and they actually, when they call me a bigot, they don't really think it's going to bother me, but they want other people watching to see what happens if you stand up, because it's going to make them less likely to stand up in the future. So just be careful. The name calling is never really about the person they're calling the names. It's about the people watching so that they learn what happens if you should dare buck the system. And a lot of times that's enough to shut people up. Okay. If a school has managed to keep queer theory mostly out by refusing the framing and jamming the bulldozer tracks, the school must follow the dictates of the State Department of Education. Yes. So even if your local schools have done all they can, they're still going to have to follow the State Department of Education. And we know that in Texas, that is definitely something that has to be complied with. The U.S. Department of Education itself is wholly captured by queer theory. Queer activists think that silence literally equates to violence. This profound and brilliant reasoning is why queer activists never stop talking, but also why they can't resist filling empty space with physical manifestations of their commitment to abolish normalcy. On the surface, pride flags are meant to mark a safe space for children living in a dangerous world. In reality, pride flags in classrooms serve as a warning sign telling all children that school outside the classroom, especially and even the classroom itself, isn't safe without queer activism. The hanging of a pride flag in a classroom only signals that power dynamics are present, power dynamics which structure social relationships in a way that privilege some students while excluding others. The pride flag hanging on a classroom wall means danger. How many teachers even know that? They're hanging it up because they want their kids to feel proud and included. And I'm being a little mocky here, but they don't know that that's what they're actually doing. Is they're saying that there's power here. Watch out, you're not safe. All right, so here's Amon the Bailey, and you're all educated now because I spent way too long on that probably. Barring the terminology of the philosopher Nicholas Schackel, the Mott and the Bailey is a rhetorical strategy where a dishonest person switches two meanings of a word or concept. The mott is a highly defensible, non-controversial proposition where the Bailey is a radical proposition. So maybe my drag show illustration isn't really it, but well, let's read more here. I'm going to read some more of the unhighlighted part. The dishonest person pushes the Bailey until caught, in which he retreats to the mott position. It's easy to defend including everyone and very hard to defend something like queer cult grooming. So again, I don't know. People won't have conversations with me, and I've tried to talk to people about this, but they've kind of shut me out. Why is it that they would choose to push a position that seems controversial in our city? And I don't understand. By hiding in the mott of inclusion, queer activists like these can lie about the cover up the true intentions of their activities. And I guess I still think the drag shows is a good example if we think of it this way. The drag show at Storybook Hour should be fine. It's the family-friendly drag shows that are not. That's more about sexualizing children, and it goes back to we set up a traumatizing, abusive situation and then provide a solution to their disorientation by being traumatized. And I just think there's more. There's nothing innocent about a man dressing as a woman, dancing in front of people, and we've been forced to be okay with it because we've been told we're not inclusive if we don't. Queer activists explicitly market Drag Queen Story Hour, that's what DQSH, as a means of fostering inclusion and empathy in schools and communities. Okay. Okay, so here, I'm going to read this bottom paragraph because I think it's important. Though Drag Queen Story Hour publicly positions its impact in helping children develop empathy, learn about gender diversity and difference, and tap into their own creativity, we argue that its contributions can run deeper than morals and role models. It is undeniable that Drag Queen Story Hour participates in many of these tropes of empathy from the marketing language the program uses to its selection of books. Much of this is strategically done in order to justify its educational value. The goal of inviting kids to Drag Queen Story Hour event isn't to teach them respect diversity and care for others who may do different than they are. The goal is to use shock and awe to confuse children, and the authors of drag pedagogy explicitly state bring queer ways of knowing and being into the education of young children. So I guess I really can't take credit for that. I think I was educated through this book to be able to present that, but it is educating young children into something that most people don't even pick up on because you are able to program them through reading books. For sure. That is to say, the goal is to push drag queens on our children as preparatory introduction to alternate modes of kinship. The goal is to induct them into the cult of queer theory. We believe that Drag Queen Story Hours offers an invitation towards deeper public engagement with queer cultural protection, particularly for young children and their families. It may be that Drag Queen Story Hours is family-friendly in the sense that it's accessible and inviting to families with children, but it is a less sanitizing force than it is a preparatory introduction to alternative modes of kinship. Here, Drag Queen Story Hour is family-friendly in the sense of family as an old-school queer code to identify and connect with other queers on the street. It makes me just sad. It makes me sad how intentional it has been to deceive and manipulate us because, again, inclusion is something we desire because we want to make people feel like they matter. And in doing so, they've played us to be part of helping groom our children to destroy everything that gives them a purpose and meaning in life. And as you can find that there is no satisfying this once you go down this road because you're always having to continue and chase after it. You never catch it. You never become queer. You're always becoming queer. And there's no hope for people who don't have an ability to find that they have value and worth as they are. If you're always striving to get there, you'll never get there. And it is so heartbreaking to watch people plead with you to give them the value and worth through the means they've been told are acceptable, knowing that by doing that, you actually only perpetuate the hell that they're going through and that they're continuing to choose to live in. The central learning objective of Drag Queen Story Hour is to brainwash kids to believe that we're all born naked and the rest is drag. Drag Queen Story Hour serves as an induction ceremony into the cult of queer theory. Drag Queen Story Hour latches on to a child's desire to play and imagine. So when people say, hey, it's just about the imagination, let kids imagine. Sadly, that's been queered. It's no longer about the innocence of children, as we'll learn later on. The innocence of children has been stolen because they don't believe that children deserve to have innocence. Drag Queen Story Hour is a grooming program for queer theory in the sense that socio-political, or cult grooming. We're just having a lot of fun while learning to read, practicing empathy, and being inclusive. It is a world dismantling effort that is meant to change children permanently. Drag Queen, let's see here, this whole paragraph. In fact, their words, a preparatory introduction to an alternative modes of kinship, clearly indicate that Drag Queen Story Hour, like much of the generative material in queer pedagogy, should be thought of as an invitation into the cult of queer activism. Parents in America expect to be the sole determiners of their children's upbringing. Queer activists would like to change that. In Washington versus Glucksberg, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment protects the fundamental right of parents to direct the care, upbringing, and education of their children. Most parents would take issue with the operational deployment of inclusion in schools. Do you hear that? Most parents would have a problem. Yet here we are in a culture battle in Abilene where many people are like, oh, not many. There's a loud vocal minority that's like out of control, upset about some things, but most parents aren't okay with you messing with their kids. If the Bailey were uncovered, parents everywhere would immediately put an end to the queer education their children are receiving. Navigating parental resistance, learning from the responses of the LGBTQ inclusive elementary school teachers can be considered a blueprint for using language to hide queer theory instruction from parents. Queer activists think parents are a significant gatekeeping mechanism meant to protect a mythical innocence that people project onto children. That's Alfred Kinsey, that children are sexual from birth. You're protecting children from a perceived innocence? A mythical innocence. All right. The first place to counter parental resistance is in the curriculum planning. This includes couching radical lessons into larger units to forward non-controversial learning objectives as cover for queer cult transformational work. Now, I didn't highlight many of those examples. There's some great examples of what they do because in Texas, parents do not have the right to know any supplemental material being taught to their children. They're only required by law, to be told about the main curriculum. And so how they do a lot of SEL, social emotional learning, and all this stuff is through supplemental material. So it's not written in the textbook what they're going to be taught, but there are conversations that the teachers are being instructed to have about children that always leads to helping them understand this. Where is it? I guess just, the queer cult transformational work. Everything is directed towards that. Math, writing, science, everything. The goal is to use strategic language to make radicalization more palatable for parents. Queer activists also use the authority of their mandated curriculum to create cover for their radical queer work. That is to say, teachers who want to practice queer theory on children can refer to the state-mandated curriculum as justification for their curricular choices. Down here it says, so I'm trying to summarize this. Parents who might not agree with the LGBTQ related content could find ways to come to terms with what the child was learning by focusing on the ELA skills. So while they may not like what they're teaching, they could go, oh, I guess I could understand how that could be a valuable lesson for our children, not realizing it's actually indoctrinating their children in queer theory. And that's what's hard is it's like, oh, well, I kind of understand why we need to make our classrooms inclusive. It's bad to exclude people, and they change things up so that you don't understand what's actually going on and they confuse you. And that is the goal. The strategic maneuver is meant to make the parent bear the weight and responsibility of a child's exclusion. So if you choose to be separated and not do that book or not do that material, then the child is being excluded because of the parent, not because of the teachers or the classroom or their friends. Queer activists are attempting to force parents to make a difficult choice. Do I protect my kids, which will ultimately confuse them and alienate them from their peers, driving them away from me and into the radical hands? Or do I let them it happen and hope for the best? And most parents are hoping for the best. All right. Queer activists hide information, gaslight, and lie to parents about what schools teach and do with children. Queer theory argues that parents are the counter-revolutionary force, a means to inculcate children with a normal and stabilizing behaviors and values. With normal and stabilizing behaviors and values, they're the counter-revolutionary. The revolutionary is to not be normal. Again, I've been talking about this, and I think you have to understand that the queer theory has nothing to do with being gay or lesbian. It is another Mott position, because the Bailey is the queer. That it's not about your sexual identity. It's just about who you are in general. Acceptance isn't the goal, because acceptance doesn't require investigating the construction, production, and maintenance of what is considered normative, nor does it challenge the status quo. The goal is destabilization. The goal is to provide a queer education for all children. The point of exposing children to the onslaught of signals, warnings, and rituals is to construct a false reality where children lose their ability to perceive the real world. That then, once destabilized and out of touch with reality, the sorcerer introduces a secret divine knowledge, a bite of the apple. Remember, Gnosticism is divine knowledge that only certain people have access to. That introduces the child to the idea that they live in a prison that must be destroyed. Children will struggle to differentiate between fantasy and reality when they return home. So you think a kid who's reading about becoming a unicorn is thinking, when the lines are being blurred about imagination are being done the way they're doing in the schools, with a book and all stuff, and they come home and they don't know what's real and what's not real. Okay, chapter 6, queer pedagogy, and that's just the practice of teaching it. You're not likely to find the words queer theory in your children's curriculum, lesson plans, or homework. Queer theory isn't taught to children, it's practiced on them. Freire defines critical consciousness as the ability to recognize, analyze, and ultimately eliminate oppression. It involves developing a deep awareness of systemic power, inequalities, and the interconnectedness of various forms of oppression. Critical pedagogy aims to teach children how to become Marxists who practice critical theory. Again, these are different flavors, but ultimately it is about getting our children to throw off Western civilization, everything we hold in value in our country, even though some people act like they don't. They really miss it. I mean, like I was just listening, which I'm hoping the next book will go into is, a book that talks about science. But, oh my gosh, his name left me, the big evolutionary Richard Dawkins. He was like, I'm not a Christian, but I really like what Christians bring to our society. So while I don't want them forcing on them, I want them to do it so that it makes our society better. And it's like, you can't have it both ways. You can't tell Christians not to be who they are and then expect society not to go in the crapper, because it does. It will. It has. It is. All right. Paulo Freire designed all his program for conscious raising, not knowledge transmission. Do you get that? They're not trying to give information. They're trying to stir up a consciousness level, which kind of checks you out. So you're not really paying attention to what you're doing. The point is to affirm the voices of marginalized students, engage them critically, while at the same time assist them in transforming their communities into sites of struggle and resistance. They're trying to make expressions of power that function to reinscribe and perpetuate social inequalities. Freire's entire program aimed to use the cover of literacy education to radicalize peasants by teaching them how to become Marxists who practice critical theory. It doesn't matter if the peasants actually learn how to read or write. The only thing that mattered was teaching peasants how to view and think about the world as a Marxist does. For Freire, literary lessons were an excuse to use classroom time to radicalize peasants. Teachers to distance themselves from their traditional roles and embrace their position of facilitators and co-learners alongside their students. Okay, sorry, I didn't read that one correctly. The initial phase requires teachers to distance themselves from their traditional roles and embrace their position of facilitators and co-learners alongside their students. Freire argues that oppressed individuals possess a unique perspective, often referred to as a standpoint or positionality in society. In Freire's program, teachers veer away from conventional teaching methods and adopt co-teaching, co-learning approach with their students, what he referred to as the Gnostic cycle. And as an educator trained in the 90s, that's what I was taught to do. I was taught to make myself level on the playing field. Don't become the source of information. Teach kids to find the information on their own. In fact, James Lindsay's book, The Marxification of Education, is a fabulous book that really helped me to understand so much of what I was taught as an educator and how so many who came after me have been taught as well. We know it's there, but most teachers don't understand what they've been taught because this Gnostic idea that teachers understand things that the common people don't do. And I speak as one myself. I mean, it's like, well, we know what we're doing is better. We know better than you because we've studied this and we've practiced it. But as now I've transitioned into homeschool mom, it's really funny how education is not about the person who knows the information. It's about how do you help the children access the information, the knowledge, not just the consciousness, but the knowledge so that they can be critical thinkers. And that's not what our schools are doing right now. The second stage of Freire's program involves teachers facilitating rather than lecturing open discussions with their students. And I feel like I'm kind of speaking a little more off the cuff and I might be more offensive, especially to many of, if my educator friends are listening, and listen, I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm trying to say, let's wake up and stop being a part of the problem because we don't even know what the problem is because we didn't even know that was part of the problem. We've been told the problem is funding. We've been told of its lack of, access to kids. I don't know what the problem is, but it's never been talked about the fact that we're teaching consciousness to children rather than knowledge. This dialogue model aims to foster conversations that elicit words, phrases, or stories known as generative themes that resonate with students. Freire encouraged teachers to push and pull conversations in political directions, waiting for their learners to say something that could be tied to oppression, like the word poverty. The point was to use the word poverty to launch into a Marxist political analysis of why people end up living in poverty. The point of problematizing something is to identify a person or a group needing saving. That is, problematizing something generates a strong emotional and moral impulse to fight for a team. The final stage of Freire's practice is decodification. In this stage, learners are asked to identify as victims. Then, through decodification, Freire asks learners to identify as the victims they have spent the entire lesson discussing, that they are the victims in the pictures, charts, and stories. So you introduce victims who are in tough situations, and then you tell the kids to identify with them, and then they become those people who are actually in the stories. It's quite brilliant, to be honest, and we've seen how positively it works in Marxifying our kids. Freire describes the overall process of critical pedagogy as teaching people how to practice critical reflection, which generates critical motivation and then critical action. Critical reflection is the reflecting on the world through the lens of critical theory. This generates a strong moral impulse, critical motivation to do something. This critical motivation leads to critical action. Activism informed and prescribed by critical theory. When educators talk of making lessons and curriculum more engaging, they are doing so because they have been programmed to believe that Freire's methods are common sense good teaching. Likewise, when educators say learners need to see themselves in the curriculum, they might not understand that see themselves reliably translate to see themselves as victims. But many today don't know where their pedagogy, which is critical, comes from because they are a few steps removed from Freire himself. Queer pedagogy is a collection of methods and practice that queer activists use to hijack regular classroom instruction to groom kids into becoming queer activists. Whereas traditional teaching creates order out of chaos, queer pedagogy creates chaos out of order. Queer pedagogy is the reason children across the United States can't go a day in school without having sex, gender, sexuality, and victimhood shoved in their faces. Queer activist is using queer pedagogy. This book talks about how one queer activist is using queer pedagogy in her 5th and 6th grade classrooms to teach mathematics. As the title implies, the queer activist isn't teaching math. She's teaching math for social justice. Math isn't the focus of the course at all. Learning to do math is the mot. The author uses her Math for Cause course to teach students to read and do math for social justice, which includes queer activism. Queer pedagogy is a collection of methods and practices that queer activists use to hijack regular classroom instruction to groom kids into becoming queer activists. Whereas traditional teaching creates order out of chaos, queer pedagogy creates... Oh, I'm sorry, I just read that one. Okay, there you go. Let's see, I added a couple in there. By decodifying the articles, the teacher was modeling the theory and practice of queer theory to her students. All right, so they look at hidden objects that interactions with everybody to see where the power struggle is. Learning to do math wasn't really the learning objective. Learning to read the world critically through math was. Queer pedagogy is not at all concerned with teaching children how to read, write, or do math. Teaching children how to develop their queer literacy, queer theory plus critical literacy, defies notions of common sense because it does not even aim to understand that which is being read. And I think that's also the problem is, having a very literate body, a literate community is not helpful for people who are trying to raise consciousness, because the more you can read, the more you can learn, the more you can learn, the more you can understand for yourself, think critically, and not be swept up into toxic ideology like queer Marxism. But when we don't really teach kids how to read for pleasure and successfully take that into their private lives, not just for reading to get through school, then we really have created a dumbed down society, which, and I take that back. I have to clarify. I did not mean, I don't know. Oh, The Crime of Education. I'm sorry. I'm getting two books. There's another great book called The Crimes of Education that is also really informative in teaching where we've gone wrong and from a different perspective. I love reading authors from different places so that I can hear how the themes come together, and that actually there's a lot of stuff that rises to the top that is all very similar and connected, even though they're not people who are communicating with each other. All right, so this part, I include this page because this is a crisis in social emotional learning. Now, I have brought this up many a times, and I think most teachers have shut me out because they don't want to hear me talk about it because they've been taught something different and they won't engage with me. That's okay. We as non-educators can actually still have a big part to play in what goes on. And we have to understand that social emotional learning is very real and present in our community, and our schools are using it. And so we have to understand why it is something we have to get rid of. For queer pedagogy to work, children must be hammered emotionally so they might desire activism rather than normalcy. Remember, you pull on those emotional strings, it gets you to respond faster than if you just use your brain. But the consciousness, the emotionalism is what draws people into a fight. It's easier to brainwash a child into a cult when they are an emotional wreck, experiencing uncomfortable disequilibrium for which they are unprepared. The instability and confusion are intentional. A crumbling foundation is a precondition of the whole project. Identity is a lever of crisis in the queer classroom. So when you bring a book about identity as the sole focus, the main focus of a children's activity in a city, a book about identity. Again, I didn't have this book when I said there's something off. There's something not right. There's something not right. And I know that it's not overt, it's covert. And if you have identity is the lever of crisis in queer classrooms, when you get children to question their identity and to push them in a position where identity is not stabilized through their family, through their parents, through what God says, it is it's an uncomfortable disequilibrium for which they are unprepared. The point of introducing kids to a taste of rainbow is to get children to identify with a position from which they can attack normalcy. Children begin to question who they are. By convincing kids that identities like non-binary and gender fluid are real, queer activists unsettle the myth of normalcy as an originary state. Queer activists convince kids that they can't identify as normal boys and girls. They must choose political positions and enter into identity crisis. This is not education. This is thought reform. This is systemized brainwashing. They are disabled by society, failing to fully accommodate their disabilities to the point where their disabilities are relevant to day-to-day life. Okay, so let me come back up here. Under what is called the social model of disability. Again, we're not talking about actual disabilities. The social model of disability interpreted critically. People with disabilities are not to be disabled by their disabilities. They are disabled by society failing to fully accommodate their disabilities to the point where those disabilities are irrelevant to day-to-day life. In fact, they are oppressed. They're disabled because they are oppressed, and it's society's fault. The queer Gnostic cycle is driven by an induced crisis that leads children into criticality. Okay, sorry. I wasn't prepared to read that word. So social emotional learning is the tool that queer activists use to help students work through their manufactured identity crisis productively. So we produce an identity crisis, then we give you the social emotional tools to help you work through it, which is unsettling to you because you're not supposed to be a normal boy or girl. You're supposed to have problems. You're supposed to be oppressed. You're a victim, and it's society's fault. All right, we're moving through this a lot faster, I think, if I hadn't talked so much. SEL is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities. Is that what you thought you were sending your school to teach them their healthy identity? I thought that was established through God's word. Manage emotions and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. As described by Castle, SEL programs are meant to be transformative, as in causing a marked change in the consciousness of children. Now remember, they are not trying to teach children to be conscious of normal behavior. They're teaching them it's not okay to be normal. You have to be something else. So of course it's going to be a social contagion that it's rampant through our schools right now, where every other child is deciding they're transgender and they don't want to be who they were created to be because being normal is wrong. I mean, it's insanity, this cycle that we've created, and we're shocked by it, and then we allow these people who've created it to be the ones in charge of fixing it. SEL pushes children to develop their character and identity through the lens of queer theory. And if you don't think that's happening, there is a supplemental program in our city that has been doing this thing from their corporate headquarters. Now, to the degree that these people are encouraging it in the classroom, I don't know because I'm not in the classroom, but all I can know is if the corporation is pushing it on their paid employees who work within the schools and have no regulations with the State School Board of Education, I'm pretty sure that there is some of this going on in our city. And we know that's the fact because so many people are pushing against us, making our city a safe place for children, where they're not being taught that normal is wrong, where they're not being emotionally manipulated to think that they have to be something other than what they were created to be. Social emotional learning is based on the transformative and humanizing Marxist methods of Paulo Freire. Castle presents a straightforward solution to help mitigate classroom behavioral issues and improve academic achievement. However, there is no academic achievement. Schools are failing here in town, including the one district that has pushed this more than the others. The others I don't think have it as bad, but I will say the one that is doing it the most is not succeeding. In practice, Castle's transformative SEL framework is a radical program that uses a child-induced emotional crisis as leverage to brainwash them. Castle's framework is less about learning and more about leverage, the ability to recognize one's own biases, to understand the links between one's personal and collective history and identities, and to recognize how thoughts, feelings, and actions are interconnected in and across diverse contexts. They becoming self-aware. They are learning that they have various identities, that their classmates have various identities, and they must understand these thoughts and feelings and actions in relation to these identities in a specific critical way, not like critical thinking way, in a critical theory kind of way. I know you're uncomfortable now that we've inverted your world, but it's okay. We can help you become more self-aware so you can finally understand who you truly are, because your parents aren't doing that. They're not showing you who you truly are. Castle, I didn't click the right button. Queer pedagogy places children in a personal and social crisis. Social awareness involves understanding social norms for constructing behavior in diverse, interpersonal, and institutional settings. In effect, social awareness is the process of taking a child standing in deconstructed rubble of their own normal world and a place they have been taught is full of evil spirits and wickedness, and placing them in loving embrace of revealed queer wisdom.
The relationship skills competence thus combines self-awareness, self-management, and social awareness to ensure that students build healthy queer relationships with their peers and teachers. Remember, it's not just about sexual, gay or lesbian. It's about your identity. And you need healthy queer relationships. Responsible students are thus only considered responsible when they become queer activists. The survey data collected will reflect children in identity crisis, which queer activism intentionally drives, and the prescribed remedy to that crisis is given as more social emotional learning. Social emotional learning then is using social emotional learning to traumatize students and then use their trauma as a justification for more social emotional learning. In other words, social emotional learning is classic snake oil. Our nation's classroom no longer focus on cultivating reading and math proficiency. They focus on manipulating a child's natural curiosity and emotions with revolutionary intentions. All right, queer activists think the purpose of education is to teach children to read the word so that they can read the world and change it through revolution. Again, it's not about critical thinking, it's about revolution. Parents see social emotional learning and think, I'm so glad my kid's school is focusing on character development and resiliency. Queer pedagogy allows one to see through the Mott and understand the Bailey. Queer activists manufacture the crisis and use cult techniques to push children to abolish normalcy. Chapter 7, Queering Developmental Psychology, Queer Cult Psychology. It should be considered criminal in many cases. Toss in pornographic and hypersexualized content found in books like It's Perfectly Normal, Genderqueer, This Book is Gay, Let's Talk About It, The Jack of Hearts, and other parts, and you have a recipe for what only can be described as sexual cult grooming. Queer activists queered development psychology, and therefore they queered what society considers developmentally appropriate. So when I stand up in front of the city council and say, listen, we've got to get these books out of the library, they're not developmentally appropriate. Well, by queer standards, they totally are. Do you see the beautiful cycle of hell we're in? It's all been queered. So it is totally fine for a child to experience violent abuse in a fictional story geared to 12 to 17-year-olds, and that's completely fine for minors to read. That is developmentally appropriate. The abuse of a minor. Roughly 8,000 child and adolescent psychologies are AACAP members, all required to follow the AACAP's Code of Ethics, such as the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. They follow their ethics and practice guidelines. This is a serious problem because the AACAP, like every other cog in the medical industrial complex, has been colonized by queer theory. It's obviously meant keeping secrets from keeping secrets from parents and setting children against their families, with queer schools playing the role of savior and protector. Children are misled to believe that parents will reject them rather than queer activism and grooming if they find out about this, driving a wedge between parents and children in order to destroy families and strengthen ties to the queer cult being promoted at school. In previous versions of the DSM, a gender identity disorder diagnosis was considered a mental health disorder. The disorder was located in identity itself, meaning clinicians should treat a person who identifies with sex other than their sex in a way that helps them overcome their identity crisis. The DSM-5, however, focuses on psychological distress a person experiences due to a mismatch between their gender identity and their assigned sex. That is, the DSM-5 doesn't consider gender dysphoria a mental health disorder or identity crisis. The DSM-5 doesn't care about the identity crisis that people with sex confusion experience. It only cares about resolving the distress brought on by the crisis. That means the principal authority for a psychiatric diagnosis in the U.S. directs psychologists to affirm the chosen identity of a sex-confused child to relieve the crisis. No longer are children considered abnormal or off track for thinking they were born in the wrong body. Instead, psychologists work tirelessly to affirm children's feelings, hoping to alleviate and resolve the distress of gender dysphoria. In practice, this amounts to affirming a child's mental health disorder and celebrating it rather than helping the child navigate it clinically in a clinically efficacious manner. Queer cult psychology finds pleasure in tearing down traditional theories of childhood development stages and replacing them with queer possibilities. All right. So this is where it just bothers me. For queer activists, the key societal constructs that justifies the traditional and alienating that Marx would use it development track is childhood innocence. The queer theory literature is unambiguous in this claim. Unambiguous. Queer activists believe that childhood innocence is a political construct that normal people use to keep children from learning about their true queer sexuality and desire. There's no such thing as queer innocence of children in the queer world. Children are sexual from birth. That's Alfred Kinsey. He wasn't Marxist, but goodness gracious, he would fit in with this cult now. The queer cult does not believe that children are innocent. Queer activists believe children are fuel of queer sexuality and desire, claiming that society just suppresses and restricts those instincts to protect a normal child and their normal future. It can't be overstated that queer theory thinks all children are sexual. The queer cult thinks society has constructed a myth of the innocent child to repress the children's sexuality. Defining children as innocent prevents all children from being exposed to queer forms of sexuality and desire before their future is settled. The innocent child has but one path to choose from: cis heterosexuality, as all other queer possibilities are deemed developmentally inappropriate. So the innocent child is a barrier they know they must destroy. All right. 20 years ago, it would have been considered child abuse to discuss sexuality and desire with little kids. 20 years ago. Queer activists think they're the only ones capable of answering questions related to sex, gender, and sexuality. Their insight is considered sacred, and they say talking to kids about sex, sexuality, and desire is not only appropriate, but necessary, because you believe children are sexual from birth. But it is not appropriate, it is not safe, and it is actually very destructive. Psychologists serve only to affirm the initiation. So they're not about fixing the problems. They're just going to affirm their identity crisis. Queering parental rights. Queer activists will not hesitate to attempt to explicitly deny a parent's fundamental right to direct the upbringing and education of their children. Queer activists have and continue to queer parental rights. Nearly half of the nation's largest school districts allow students to use names and pronouns at school aligned with their gender identity without parental knowledge and consent. Queer activists groom children into cult identities. Gender identity politics have everything to do with hiding a student's gender identity from parents. Gender identity does not exist outside of queer theory, and gay children don't have a gender identity. They just happen to be gay. Said another way, gender identity politics aren't implemented to conceal a child's potential sexual preference. Gender identity politics are designed and implemented to hide what a child is becoming. If that doesn't terrify you, I don't know. They're hiding it. Queer activists do not shy away from their attentions. Remember, parents are not entitled to know their kids' identities. That knowledge must be earned. Seems to fly in face of the 14th Amendment, like was previously mentioned. They have to earn the knowledge of their child's identity. Queer activists groom children into queer theory by queering school policies, procedures, classroom norms, and teaching methods. They push kids to deconstruct their identities critically until a child no longer knows who they are. By gender development, their policy isn't referring to sexual development, something that a parent would want a qualified and competent pediatrician to monitor in their child. By gender development, the statement refers to gender identity development, something that nearly all parents do not want their pediatrician discussing with their child. Likewise, most parents do not want their pediatrician affirming or validating anything other than their parental rights to refuse such radical social medical practices. The only way to handle a child that says they've adopted a new gender identity is to affirm that choice. That's the only path forward. Any other methods of clinical care, such as helping a child understand their confusion, anxiety, or genuine care of sex confusion, which is called gender dysphoria, in a safe and efficacious clinical setting, are tantamount to a gender identity change effort, which APA categorizes as harmful, prejudicial, and discriminatory. Parents are told the only way to help trans kids be who they really are is to pursue dangerous drugs and experimental medical procedures. And it's so encouraging that state by state, they are slowly stopping this maddening process of destroying our children. All right, so this sworn testimony says that medical establishments' use of moral bullying to push parents into consenting to gender-affirming treatment plans for their children. They are bullying parents to say, if you don't do this, your child will commit suicide, and that is a position no parent wants or should be put in. Puberty blockers are incredibly dangerous. They give you permanent sterility. The U.S. is now a nation that fast-tracks children into life-altering and dangerous psychosocial medical experiments. Parents don't know what is happening in their children's school. They don't know because queer activists gaslight and lie to them. Queer theory and parental rights are irreconcilable concepts. Let me say that again. Queer theory and parental rights are irreconcilable concepts. Conclusion. Queer cult magic. Like queer activism, queer teaching always works through crisis. The goal is to continue teaching and learning through crisis, to continue experiencing the queer. The cult of queer theory practices their cult religion every day in classrooms nationwide. That same word, same word is given more than one meaning. So queer activists redefine language without telling you specifically in technical terms. They employ what is known as conceptual polysemy, which means the same word is given for more than one meaning. The cult's meaning for word always interprets the concept through critical consciousness and the assumption of pervasive systemic power dynamics. For example, the term inclusion in queer activism means including queer theory activism and activists and arranging circumstances so they are prioritized and feel centered, which is different than being open to everyone in a way that doesn't account for power dynamics like cis heteronormativity. They then allow people to assume the usual meaning of the word open to all. Inclusion, you think, means open to all. No, it doesn't. Not at all. While intending a specialist cult meaning queer prioritization to make up for alleged systemic queer exclusion, and at need strategically equivocate between the meaning of the words, the Mott and the Bailey strategy. By doing this, the cult inner school can communicate with one another in secret while speaking out in the open. The cult teaches her that she must celebrate and practice diversity, equity, inclusion to give each of her future students, an equal shot at the same outcome. All right, so let me back that up. This is the problem I think we're dealing with here. I don't think we have a bunch of inner circle people who are trying to promote this on all of our kids. However, the typical teacher administrator is initiated in the cult of queer theory during her studies at university. There she learns that society is designed to be unfair, and the educator's job is to join her students in reading the word to change the world, okay? So she practices diversity, equity, inclusion to give her students a future shot at the same outcome. She learns that no one accepts children for who they really are, even their parents. She enters the classroom thinking she has learned the best way to teach children how to read and write, not knowing that all of her training is meant to push her to teach children to read and write as part of the process of becoming conscious of one's experience as historically constructed within specific power relations. Her training pushes her to teach children to be Marxists. Queer theory has captured the entire medical establishment. Many kids that walk through the door would otherwise be considered normal and healthy in the mind and body had queer activism not poisoned them. Queer theory teaches kids that life itself is a prison. Rainbow Guards are the quintessential lever of cultural revolution. They've used their position to redwash our history. Mao was a chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, founder of the People's Republic of China, and the poster boy of the New Left in the 1960s. And now we know the New Left became the academic left, now runs our school. You can still hear the infamous 1960s chants, Marx, Mao, Marcuse, echoed through college campuses today. Mao had enlisted the youth of China as his instrument for reimposing his will upon the nation and reshaping it according to his vision. Mao understood well that children wished to conform to the standards of their peers. Anyone deemed insufficiently socialist was targeted for thought reform, where psychological torture methods coerced fake confessions for fabricated crimes. Radicalism is great for destabilizing a society so you can eliminate your enemies and take total control. Queer activists are brainwashing children to overthrow our existing society so it can be replaced with a new society. When the time comes, the Rainbow Guard will be treated like everyone else, suffering under new and more brutal definitions, categories, and regulations. The inner circle only cares about securing power to mold the world in its image. So, we must constantly question and criticize our teachers and school administrators when they implement any policies or procedures rooted in queer theory. To do this, we must study queer theory and use discernment to determine whether or not a policy or procedure aligns with queer religious doctrine. They believe they are saving their child from you. A child has value to conservative activists. They are the future conservatives want to win. Parental rights are merely one path toward the total capture of state power and the imposition of authoritarian hierarchy on us all. In this perspective, rights aren't innate. They determined instead of by a person's place in the conservative hierarchy. The opposite view that everyone has a right by virtue of their humanity requires us to change the way we commonly think of children. Liberals aren't immune to the belief that children are property. The mainstream fear-mongering over trans youth tells us that much. Yet combating the powers of parental right movement requires an answering conviction in the rights of children. We can see them as people, uniquely vulnerable, yes, but nevertheless people who have independent minds and will develop private lives of their own. Parents must reintroduce their children to normalcy of reality, untethered from the cult control, cutting out and exposing any queer propaganda for what it is, poison. The regime hates mockery and laughter, and it makes a lot of mistakes when it's upset and people aren't taking it seriously anymore. Queer activists want a critical mass of unstable people so they can wield them like a sledgehammer against the status quo. Surround your children with people who aren't cultists. Show them how great normal feels. Queer theory clearly violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Our schools endorse and promote queer theory with extreme prejudice. Many of our public officials and professionals are queer activists, and they practice queer theory by creating queer speech codes, policies, procedures, and practices. They use queer pedagogy to work to convert children into the queer cult. In the end, the cult always self-implodes. That's the good news. We can accelerate the process with discernment, exposure, and the rule of law. So we did it. We finished. And it took a little bit longer today, but I did share a little bit more insight in what I've learned along the way. And I hope that you will subscribe and share this with your family and friends, because again, we can't stop this if we don't understand what it is. And we've got to start being more active in making sure that there are no policies or procedures that are allowing our kids to be queered in the way that most educational establishments are trying to do. Again, I don't think there are many people who are doing this with the intent of queering our children. I just don't think they've been able to differentiate what they've been taught in their professional training and what is going on in the world today. And it's our job to make sure we become educated and informed so that we can be empowered to make an impact in Abilene and the big country. And until next time.